The paper, Strengthening Inflation Targeting, Review and Renewal Processes in Canada and Other Advanced Jurisdictions by Amano, Carter, and Schembri, looks at the role that periodic framework review and renewal processes have played in evolving the approach to monetary policy in Canada and other advanced economies. It provides a detailed history of the evolution of these processes in Canada, New Zealand, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Le document met en relief les différences entre ces processus d'examen et de renouvellement selon plusieurs critères: gouvernance, la synchronisation, et les modalités d'exécution. With several advanced economy central banks embarking on high-profile review processes in recent years, this paper serves as a useful backdrop to the bank's upcoming conference on how our 2021 review and renewal process is proceeding. With me is Deputy Governor Larry Schembri. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
One of the authors of the paper. I've got a lot of questions, so why don't we dive right in? We maybe start with some overview questions. So what sparked your interest in putting this paper together, focused on monetary policy review and renewal processes?
Well, as you mentioned, Jeremy, a number of major jurisdictions, central banks have sort of embarked on review processes, like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. And they've actually looked at our process very closely and very favorably, and they've actually called on us for our expertise. So given the interest in what we've done in Canada, we thought this was a good subject for us to take a closer look at. And what we found is that there's, in a number of jurisdictions, their approaches to review and renewal have actually converged towards the approach we've taken. And so we feel this contributes to the literature on the political economy of central banking and provides a useful background for our own renewal coming up in 2021.
So what is the distinction between a review and a renewal process, and why is that distinction important?
Well, the review process is really more all-encompassing. It looks at the different elements of the monetary policy framework, the mandate, the tools, the implementation, and it draws from a wide set of sources, whether it be central bank research and experience, as well as academic research, as well as consultations with interested stakeholders. So it draws from a wider set of sources. Whereas the renewal is a more formal process where the mandate of the monetary policy framework of the central bank is actually renewed typically with the government. So it's a narrower process than the review. And what we found is that across jurisdictions, the relationship between the review and the renewal can be different. Now in Canada, the review and the renewal are closely tied. The renewal follows after the review.
Avant d'entrer dans les détails, quels sont les principaux points à retenir de ce document?
Malgré les différences des processus de révision et renouvellement parmi les pays, on constate des points de convergence, notamment en termes de transparence, de portée et aussi de régularité. On trouve aussi que les approches différentes ne produisent pas de cadres ou de résultats macroéconomiques très divergents.
So you've looked at the cases of Canada, Sweden, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Why did you choose to focus on these central banks and not others like, say, the ECB or the Reserve Bank of Australia?
Well, first off, we wanted to keep the project relatively manageable given time constraints, but the feeling was that these 5 jurisdictions sort of offered the most interesting, insightful comparison across approaches. And I think we've actually been able to draw some interesting findings from this comparison.
So let's dive into the details a little bit. Why don't we start with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand? What were the main sort of takeaways when you looked at their processes and how it's evolved over the course of decades?
As you know, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand started inflation targeting roughly the same time we did, and they did have a process in place to renew the mandate with the government, and it was called the Policy Target Agreement, and that was supposed to be renewed between the government and the central bank on an ongoing basis. But what we found is that those renewals typically took place after an election. So the newly elected government took it upon themselves to renegotiate the policy target agreement with the Reserve Bank. So what that implied is that the renewal was tied into the political process and the political cycle. And so that made it a lot different than the process we have in Canada, where it's a regular 5-year term. The other interesting aspect about the process in New Zealand was that the review and the renewal were not closely tied. There were some reviews that they drew upon external reviewers to conduct, but the relationship between the review and the renewal was not as close as we have here in Canada. And what's interesting more recently is that they've actually moved to an approach that's similar to ours, that they're going to approach that has a 5-year cycle to it, that's not tied to the political cycle.
Why don't we move to Europe now and maybe just highlight what stands out about the Riksbank and the Bank of England processes?
Well, the Riksbank is interesting because it's really Parliament that takes responsibility for instigating the review, and so they rely on external reviewers to conduct the review. So that's a different aspect relative to some of the other jurisdictions. The second part is the fact that there's not a formal renewal process in the sense, because the Riksbank is relatively independent, some of the renewals can actually be undertaken by the Riksbank Executive Board. So contrary to Canada, where there's a joint agreement between ourselves and the government, the Riksbank itself can actually renew its own mandate.
And the Bank of England?
And the Bank of England, yeah, thank you. What's interesting there is that there is this annual remit given by the Treasury to the Monetary Policy Committee. And so it's a government-led initiative, and it's not really related to a sort of open, transparent review process like we have here in Canada. So it's a different setup. I know they've done they did a review, I think, before Governor Carney became governor at the Bank of England, but it wasn't the same sort of nature as ours, where it was transparent, research-driven, like we have here in Canada.
Qu'est-ce qui vous a paru particulièrement intéressant du processus de révision récente de la Réserve fédérale?
Pour la Réserve fédérale, le grand changement est un passage d'un processus plutôt privé à un processus plus ouvert et public, avec un grand nombre de parties prenantes. On verra comment ce processus d'examen sera pris en compte par le processus de renouvellement annuel et s'il sera répété régulièrement à l'avenir.
What would you say are the most distinctive features of the Canadian process?
Well, as I mentioned, it's a regular 5-year process. We started that in 2001. We've also been very deliberate. We usually establish a number of questions that we feel are important for the review. It's very open and transparent. We typically publish all the research and the speeches online so people can really take a close look at what we're doing. And we try to make a strong effort to engage a lot of stakeholders. So it's a very open, wide-ranging kind of review process. And what we find important is that our research is really tied to the review. So a lot of effort goes into the review. And we feel that gives our research clear focus. The second aspect that's important for our process is the renewal. And we do have this formal renewal of the Joint Inflation Target Agreement with the government. And so that's sort of the capstone of the review process. We do have this renewal with the government. And I think the important aspect of the joint agreement is that it gives the bank operational independence, and it gives the mandate political legitimacy, because both the government and the Bank of Canada are jointly responsible for achieving the inflation target.
The bank's done all this research over the course of many renewals. What refinements to the monetary policy framework has all that research ultimately led to?
One aspect I think is very important is this notion of target horizon flexibility. When we call ourselves flexible inflation targeters, I think over the process of a number of renewals, we've actually come to define what we mean about flexibility. And what that means is really taking into account different aspects, adjusting the horizon over which we try to return inflation back to target. And so the notion is when we set a path for the interest rate, to return inflation to target, we can extend or contract that horizon, taking into account the impact of the interest rate path on the volatility of employment and output, as well as the implications for financial vulnerabilities. And that's the second aspect that we've taken a close look at is this nexus between monetary policy and financial stability. And one of the things that we've focused on is initially in sort of in the 2006 renewal, we looked at asset prices as the main vulnerability that financial systems were facing. Over time, we've now broadened that to a wider set of financial vulnerabilities. And again, I think the main finding from that review is really the fact that we should be mindful of the impact of the interest rate path we set for returning inflation to target, taking into account the impact on financial vulnerability. So that's where this flexible horizon, I think comes in importantly. The other thing we've looked at is really the optimal level of the inflation target. In 2011, we looked at lowering the inflation target from 2% to somewhere below, and then in 2016, we looked at raising the target somewhere above 2%. In both cases, we found that the 2% seemed to balance the benefits and the costs. And part of the 2011 renewal, we also looked at this particular mandate or framework called price level targeting. And the last thing we've done is really, in terms of how we implement monetary policy, and one of the things we've looked at is measures of core inflation and how we use them in terms of implementing monetary policy.
Vous citez le processus canadien comme la meilleure de sa catégorie, mais vous n'utilisez pas des experts indépendants. Est-ce qu'il y a d'espace pour améliorer le processus ici au Canada?
On peut toujours mieux faire notre processus. Pour le cycle de renouvellement de 2021, nous consultons un plus grand nombre de parties prenantes qu'autrefois, en complément de nos recherches internes. En ce qui concerne les experts externes, nous comptons sur eux pour examiner notre travail et aussi pour apporter leurs propres idées et recherches. Cela ne veut pas dire qu'ils ne pourraient pas jouer un rôle plus direct à l'avenir. Il y a peut-être des questions que ces experts sera mieux placés pour examiner.
So looking across all the cases studied in this paper, a few questions emerge. How valuable are these renewal and review processes? Why do you think they've converged closer to each other over the years? And what do you see as really the best practice, having had a long look at all of these different processes?
Well, the fact that a number of major jurisdictions are undertaking these review processes, I think stresses that engendering public support and political legitimacy for central banks is very important. And I think this is a result of, the policies that we've had to implement, after the global financial crisis and more recently given the challenge we're facing. We've gone beyond using simple, the interest rate as our main policy tool. We've moved to a wider set of instruments that have been more controversial, for example, large asset purchases. And so I think having that kind of political support is critical for the credibility of the central bank. And so I think that's why a lot of other central banks have turned to these sorts of processes. For us, having these wide-ranging reviews that are on a regular basis have really, I think, helped us improve our monetary policy framework over time. In particular, they've given a clear focus to our research, which we found very valuable. And the fact that a number of other central banks have converged to a process that we've been using for a number of years is a strong signal that what we've been doing is really appropriate for central banks in terms of building broad public support and credibility of our framework. And I think it really speaks to the soundness of our approach.